So let's talk a little bit about what this can look like on the ground or some different directions that it can take. Mark or Jennifer, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I've also got some questions from the chat.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Roslyn's point about statements. I think statements are a necessary but insufficient condition for change on campus. I think there's basically, the way I try and think about it is there's four things that you need to do. It's sort of like four C's. So one is codes, and I don't mean speech codes, but I mean, what are the policies, laws that we have in place, right, that support free expression? So it's sort of the legal basis for what we're doing. So that's the codes. And then the second part is culture, because you can have all the codes you want, and if the culture just ignores it or finds a way around it, which I think happens often, then it's really all for naught, right? It is just talk. So you need to fundamentally change the culture. Well, culture is made up of humans, and these people, it's very hard to change humans. So the way you would have to change humans is a couple other ways, right? You'd have to state what the cultural values are, and which are primary. And the second, so then the two other C's would be communications. There's got to be communications from the top down, and people showing up at these events from the top and all the way through the organization. So not just from the top and the chancellor and the provost, but the deans and the department chairs, which will take some time. And then the last part is competencies. So I think the way you get around the free speech versus hate speech is you give people competencies to understand what is free speech, what is a heckler's veto, and how to have constructive dialogues, especially the constructive dialogue piece, because it's hard to do that. It's a skill that you have to acquire. But if you're able to get people to have constructive dialogues, the concern about offending people should be lessened, right? Because people are trying to be sensitive and have a conversation that isn't just I'm telling you what I want you need to hear, right?
I think that one way to approach doing that, one way to approach teaching students constructive dialogue is to model that in your classrooms, right? So if instructors or faculty are getting up in front of the class and making it clear from the beginning of the semester that the free exchange of ideas is what is required for us all to learn and to be successful, and this is how we have those conversations, then I think that is a huge step towards changing the culture on campus. And I think that that's something that we have moved away from. We don't think about putting that in our syllabi. We don't think about making that blanket statement at the beginning of class. And so a lot of students are afraid to speak up because they're afraid that they're going to go against the prevailing narrative in class of what the other students are saying, or they're afraid that they're going to offend their professors. And they're not being taught those skills that they need that will carry forward after they graduate and go out in the world, and then they can become better citizens, right? That's what we're hoping for. So I think if we start in the classroom, that's going to be monumental.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really excellent articulation of where we need to be. And I think shameless plug, right, for HXA. When we started this conversation 10 minutes ago, the ground rules were established, and they were pretty basic. Support your arguments with evidence, examples where possible. Be mutually respectful. Be yourself. Be authentic in your expressions. Those are as basic as share. Get along with your neighbor, say please and thank you. I mean, the very same rules that we start teaching children in kindergarten. Don't want to be pithy about everything I need to know I learned in kindergarten. But sincerely, at the outset of this conversation, those very clear 4, 5, 6 ground rules really can guide us in a very obvious way when we think about education. And to your point about modeling, our faculty are so critically important in this effort, because we all believe in free speech until somebody says something we don't like. And students are going to test limits. Students are going to test limits, as they should, right? They pay money for this learning experience that is supposed to be a growth experience for them, supposed to teach them how to think more critically. They are going to test boundaries. And if the faculty member, if the administration is unwilling, listen, I love protest until they're sitting in front of my office, right? I've got to be okay with them sitting in front of my office and be willing to engage and listen to their perspective. And I think the modeling point that you made just really can't be overstated, excuse me.
Right. One of the advisors to HXA, Professor Robert George from Princeton, recently was the object of a shout down you may have seen in the headlines. And one of the news accounts quoted a student saying, well, we know they can't expel us all. And so that struck me as, among other things, an educational failure, because there's great room for protest. There's a difference between that and the heckler's veto that Mark mentioned. But if that's the main lesson you're getting from a college experience, then I kind of fear for the future a little bit.
I think part of the problem too is the student is the customer attitude, right? So we can't get them upset at all. And to your point about the protests, I mean, basically no administrator that I've seen so far is willing to stand up and remove people from classrooms, and then follow through with suspensions or expulsion. So there is no downside. There's only upside for the people that are protesting. They're going to be heroes in front of their friends. They will have made their point, right? So I think there's just, if you think about the incentives, until someone's kid gets expelled from like Stanford or a top school, it's going to continue. There's no stopping it.
If anyone in the room is from Stanford, I think that's a really interesting case where the dean issued a memo and sort of called for some re-education. But to your point, Mark, I don't know what kind of consequences were involved. And of course, there's so many of these, and each of them have different nuances. Let me pull in a couple of questions as we've got a nice Q&A going here. So one question comes from Jacqueline, and I think you touched on this briefly, Mark, but we hear this a lot. Her question is, how do you counter the idea that speech is harm? And, it's probably hard to overstate how prevalent that sentiment is. And, to try to steel man it for a moment, people will say, we're social creatures, we humans, and psychological harm is real, and we need to take this seriously. If we have concern for respect and other great virtues like that, then how could we tolerate and then fill in the expression that you're objecting to? It's something. I'm here at the Center for Academic Pluralism in New York, where our fellows, some of them, are chewing on this question. But any thoughts on that from your campus? In other words, how do we counter the idea that speech is harm, quote unquote?
I mean, I think you can acknowledge that, yes, words can be hurtful. I don't think you can. I think it's wrong to conflate it that with the idea that words are violent. I don't think those are the two same things. And I think also the other thing that we need to do is really get back to teaching students resilience. I mean, the environment is going to only get more dynamic. It's going to get more, chaotic in terms of with generative AI and how technology is changing, what's changing in the world with rising China, what's happening in Ukraine. I think the world is going to be changing faster and faster. And instead of telling people you're going to have a safe space, we need to say, we're going to make you resilient. We're going to make you anti-fragile so you can grow from the challenges you face. And part of that is hearing things that might upset you. So yeah, I don't think we can go down the path of stopping free expression because of.
It isn't our fundamental responsibility as educators, very much what you just said, whether we characterize it as anti-fragility or resilience or whatever the case may be. It's teaching kids to cope. It's teaching kids to process information, to respond in a manner that is coherent and articulate and clear. I serve at a historically Black college. My population is homogenous to some extent, right? And there's this assumption that everybody on my campus feels a certain way, right? That everyone is a Democrat, that everyone is liberal, that everyone is, And that may or may not be the case. And it's really none of my concern, quite frankly. Everyone is entitled to their own perspective. And yet this myopia that settles in creates this really strange experience for a student who is courageous enough to be different. And so one of the questions is, how are we protecting people from being shouted down and those kinds of things? It is teaching students the skill, the art of listening, of engaging in a meaningful way, of respectful dialogue that is evidence-based, and at the very least thoughtful. It's okay to say, I feel, that hurts me, I am offended by, and then be okay with the response. And so I think the fundamental goal of education really is to teach students to cope and to be participants in a civil society. And that requires some level of resilience and strength.